really pleased to be here. And Anne-Marie introduced me as one of the two Canadians on the panel. And I want to start by saying how proud I am to tell you today that in less than a month, I am also going to be an American. I have my swearing-in ceremony on May 16th. So this is a big thrill for me. I've been living in Michigan for almost 16 years now, working at Michigan State University, and it has been an enormously rewarding and enriching experience to have spent all that time in what will soon be my country. So this afternoon, what I'm going to talk to you about, as Anne-Marie indicated, is invasive species. And I think you all know that invasive species is a very important issue for the Great Lakes. And what I'm going to try to do is to take a kind of a long-run perspective. If I had a title for my presentation, it would be Invasive Species, Past, Present, and Future. And I'd like this story to be kind of a cautionary tale for all of us about managing risk. So the story in the past is going to be about sea lamprey. As Anne-Marie indicated, I've done quite a lot of work on sea lamprey. And the sea lamprey is kind of an interesting invasive species in the Great Lakes because it's been around for so long that I think we sometimes forget about what a incredibly important invasive species in the worst possible sense of the word sea lamprey have been. Sea lamprey entered or were able to access the upper Great Lakes, Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, and Lake Superior when we made modifications to the Welland Canal in the early part of the 20th century. And they spread pretty quickly through the Great Lakes, particularly into the upper Great Lakes. And as probably most of you know, once sea lamprey became established in the upper Great Lakes, they literally wreaked ecological and economic havoc on the fisheries of Lakes Michigan, Huron, and Superior, resulting in the extirpation of lake trout from Lake Michigan and the near extirpation of lake trout from Lake Huron. This was a very important economically and socially important fishery that was essentially destroyed by the sea lamprey. When the sea lamprey became the problem that they became, in classes that I teach at MSU, I sometimes, with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek, tell students that the sea lamprey was the best thing that ever happened to the Great Lakes. And the reason I say that is because the sea lamprey presented such an incredible challenge that it forced management agencies, Great Lakes management agencies on both sides of the international border to join together to tackle this problem in a way that they had never done before 1955 when the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was created. And that has resulted in not only a very effective sea lamprey control program that's been in place since the late 1950s, so over 50 years now, but it also developed an incredibly positive relationship amongst the federal and state and provincial fishery management agencies that all were working together to address a common enemy. Now, I wouldn't want you to take away from that I think we should let more invasive species into the Great Lakes so that we can become even more united about them. But it is an interesting example of how a common enemy can really unite us. We've, as I say, made an awful lot of progress in controlling sea lamprey, but we still spend almost $20 million a year keeping sea lamprey under control. So if you do the arithmetic, that means that since sea lamprey program control began, it has cost the Canadian and U.S. governments roughly $1 billion to manage the sea lamprey program. And it's not any cheaper now than it was 40, 50 years ago. So that just gives you an indication of how the magnitude of the consequences of allowing invasive species into the Great Lakes and the ones that have severe economic and ecological impacts. But I would also want to emphasize that $1 billion has been an essential investment on the part of those agencies to support an annual $1 billion recreational and commercial fishery in the Great Lakes. So the cost benefit has been there, but the cost has nevertheless been enormous. So that's the past. The present, I'm going to talk about mussels. And you've all heard of zebra mussels, and probably many of you have heard of quagga mussels, which are the relative of the zebra mussel that is really, it's the quagga mussels that are really the, if you will, the problem in the Great Lakes. The mussels invaded the Great Lakes in the mid-1980s, and they arrived in the ballasts of ocean-going vessels. Many other species have done that as well. But mussels have probably had more profound and consequential impacts than any of the other species so far that have entered the Great Lakes in ballast water. You know, it's the mussel story is kind of interesting. It's much more complicated than the sea lamprey story. It's pretty obvious what sea lamprey did to the ecosystem in the Great Lakes. In the case of mussels, many people look at the lakes that have had zebra mussels or quagga mussels in them, and they say, wow, the water's much cleaner or clearer. So that seems like a good thing. But the effects that the zebra and quagga mussels have had on the Great Lakes and are continuing to have on the Great Lakes, we're still learning about those. But I think most ecologists would agree that those effects have been enormous. Some of the examples is mussels have profoundly changed the way in which nutrients move around in the Great Lakes. The phosphorus and nitrogen that comes into the Great Lakes from watersheds is now being made available to different organisms in the Great Lakes, with the result that we're seeing things like incredible problems with blooms of large filamentous algae called cladophora. So if any of you know commercial fishermen who curse about the algae on their nets, or you've seen this stuff washing up on beaches, you know what I'm talking about. There's a critter that probably many of you have never seen. It's called Diperai. It's a little kind of shrimp-like creature that lives on the bottom of the Great Lakes. And as best as we can tell, Diperai is virtually gone from Lake Michigan now. And as best as we can tell, it's virtually gone because zebra mussels and quagga mussels are there. We can't prove that, but I think that's the most likely explanation for the coincidence of the arrival of these mussels and the disappearance of this organism. Why do we care about this organism? Well, it's the most important food item for really valuable fish species like whitefish. And so losing Diperai as a result of the mussel invasion is a big deal. What have we done about zebra mussels? Well, unlike the sea lamprey, we still haven't come up with a way to control zebra and quagga mussels. What we have done is we've closed the barn door after the cows got out. We've made some very good measures to reduce the risk of future ballast water introductions of organisms, and I suppose that's a good thing, but it is closing the barn door a little bit late as far as that critter is concerned. So that's kind of the past and the present, and now I'm going to get to the invasive species that you all expected me to talk about, no doubt, the one that isn't in the Great Lakes yet. Anybody want to guess what that was, what that is? Asian carp, right, okay. So they're not here yet. At least we don't think they're here yet. You've probably seen the reports that we have found some Asian carp DNA in the Great Lakes, but we really haven't seen, we don't have any proof that Asian carp are in the Great Lakes, but as I'm sure you all know, they're pretty darn close. They're in the Illinois River. They're very abundant there. We know that there's a very real threat of Asian carp entering the Great Lakes. What we don't know, and I'll be honest with you, is what would happen to the Great Lakes if the Asian carp were to enter our ecosystem and establish. And some people might argue that the fact that we don't know, that we don't have any incontrovertible evidence that Asian carp would wreak havoc on the Great Lakes means that maybe we shouldn't worry about it so much. The problem is that this is a very, very inexact world and science. And if I think about lampreys, when the lampreys entered the Great Lakes 60, 70 years ago, if there had been a group of ecologists sitting around a table asking, well, what do you think is going to happen? I bet you the majority of them have said, they're just a fish that feeds on other fish out in the ocean. Why would they be any big deal in the Great Lakes? They were a hell of a big deal in the Great Lakes. And then on the other hand, we had a critter that invaded the Great Lakes about 20 years ago called the Eurasian ruff. It was first found in the harbor in Duluth. And when that fish was found, we started to run around and say the sky is falling, that this is a fish that's going to compete with perch and walleye and going to have devastating impacts on our ecosystem. And it hasn't. So what does that tell us? It doesn't tell us that we shouldn't worry about ruff, or we shouldn't have worried about ruff. It doesn't tell us that we shouldn't have worried about lampreys. And so it doesn't tell us that we shouldn't worry about Asian carp. Asian carp, in my mind, not only do they present a very, very serious threat to our ecosystems, but they're also a symbol of the importance of dealing with the risk. And the risk with Asian carp is largely related to the connection of the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. And I think whether Asian carp themselves get into the Great Lakes and whether they have impact or not, as long as the Great Lakes are connected in the way they are to the Mississippi River and the Illinois River, we are sitting on a time bomb, because we frankly don't know which of these species that invade our ecosystems, as my story has hopefully told you. We don't know what they're going to do, but we know the risks can be very, very large, and the consequences can be economically devastating. So invasive species, unfortunately, there are no simple answers other than the more we can do to prevent them, the less likely we're taking, enormous economic risks. So thank you.